money. Just like other loans, that is expressed in an interest rate. So the higher the interest rate, the more expensive it is to borrow money, as the borrower will be paying more each year in interest. On the other hand, the lower the interest rate, the cheaper it is to borrow money, as the borrower will be paying less in interest on that loan. What I'm about to say gets to the core of Ray Dalio's warning, and it is super important. The U.S. national debt is currently at a whopping $34 trillion and is getting larger by the day. This is up from $22 trillion in 2019 and from roughly $5 trillion in national debt back in the year 2000. As Dalio explained, the U.S. is heading towards a tipping point. The national debt has grown so large that there is a real possibility that there is more government debt outstanding than money available from investors to buy it. If this turns out to be true, the consequences will likely be dire. Here's how. Going back to our supply and demand graph, let's shift our demand line up and see what happens. Moving our demand line up represents the U.S. government needing more money to cover its ever-growing debt. Notice how now the two lines cross at a higher interest rate. If government debt grows, while the supply of money available from investors remains the same, the U.S. government will be forced to pay a higher interest rate to borrow money. Let's push our demand line even further up. As you can see, the two lines cross now at an even higher interest rate. Higher borrowing costs for the U.S. government would be extremely painful for the country and its citizens given the massive amount of national debt the country has. Here's a thought experiment for you to demonstrate what I mean. As mentioned earlier in the video, the U.S. national debt is roughly $34 trillion. If we assume a 2% annual interest rate on that debt, that means the U.S. government has to pay $680 billion in interest each and every year just to stay current on its debt. This is easily calculated by taking the debt outstanding and multiplying it by the interest rate. For reference, in 2023, the U.S. government had an annual budget of $6.13 trillion to cover all of its spending for the year. This spending including things such as social programs, education, healthcare, the military, the list goes on, but you get the point. In our example here, the $680 billion annual interest rate on the national debt makes up roughly 11% of the entire annual budget. That means that 11% of the annual budget is spent not on providing services and resources to citizens, but instead just paying interest on debt the country incurred in the past. You are able to see how this can create what is referred to by Ray Dalio as a debt spiral. Let's see what happens when interest rates increase. Let's take the interest rate on the debt up to 6%. That annual interest expense jumps up to roughly $2 trillion. Now, the annual interest expense on the national debt makes up 33% of the entire national budget. Let's take things up even one step further and bump the interest rate up to 10%. That annual interest expense skyrockets all the way to a whopping $3.4 trillion. This annual interest expense would take up a staggering 55% of the entire federal government's current annual budget. You can see now why Dalio is referring to this as a crisis. While this is of course just an example, according to Dalio, it is a likely outcome unless some significant changes are made.